Welcome back to another episode of Azure AI Essentials. Today, we're going to take a look at how you can scale your applications with Azure Cognitive Services. Because this is such a critical topic with a lot of rich information, I've invited Amy, one of Azure AI's expert cloud advocates, to help us unpack this topic.
Hi, Myrna. It's great to be chatting with you today, and I'm really excited to be talking about Azure Cognitive Services, how they scale themselves, but also how they can help you scale your projects.
Great. Let's get started with the basics. We often talk about scalability when it comes to cloud services, and it's a very popular reason for moving applications to the cloud. So, what is scalability, and why is it so important to consider early on in app development?
Great question. Scalability is the ability to grow your business or your service on a sort of pay-as-you-go format, meaning there's no sort of high upfront investments on machines, etc. There's also no need to have specific types of technology for specific solutions or trying to put things where they shouldn't be going, but actually you get full flexibility to create that solution. There's also some cool stuff now with cloud computing where scaling features are there to help you automatically. So you might look at things like scaling vertically, which means scaling up the size of a machine, or you might look at scaling horizontally, where you're scaling basically the number of concurrent occurrences of those machines in order to use that workload well.
So since I'm working with AI developer technology, specifically Azure Cognitive Services, what do I need to consider with regards to scaling? Do I need to consider both horizontal and vertical scaling features?
Well, actually, Azure Cognitive Services has really been built with scalability in mind. And so one of the key things I wanted to talk to you about was the ability for, instead of us having to think about scaling up or out of machines for cognitive services, it kind of does it all for you, which is great. One of the best ways that I kind of think about this in my mind is serverless compute. So serverless compute has become very, very popular, and it's the idea of running code and not having to worry about the infrastructure that it runs on. Well, cognitive services is very, very similar. So if I have an Azure function and I call it 10 times or 1,000 times, I still write exactly the same code for those two different transactions. It's the same with cognitive services. If I call the computer vision API and ask it to describe 10 images, or I ask it to describe 1,000 images, it's exactly the same. And so the service has actually already dealt with the scalability for you.
Wow. So I don't really have to do anything. Azure Cognitive Services takes care of it all.
Exactly. The next way, actually, that Azure Cognitive Services has been built with scale in mind is actually considering sort of the changes in your API usage. So say your application goes viral, you see a huge influx of usage of this feature, so within the cognitive services. You can actually scale up, say, the front end of your application and maybe the back end of your application, and Azure can help you with that as well. But actually, the API, the Azure Cognitive Services API, will scale automatically for you, so you don't need to worry too much about that.
So developers don't need to worry about scaling this part of the solution architecture either. It's no wonder we see fascinating statistics across our services. Just in March 2021 alone, we saw 53 billion transactions using cognitive services APIs.
Exactly right. Huge numbers, and many, many people are scaling their applications. And actually, that's where I kind of wanted our last consideration to go. Azure AI can help you scale your projects and the pace at which you create those projects. So if we think about these AI models that Microsoft builds, they have incredibly large data sets and they spend time training and building these different models for you to use through an API call. If you think about the opposite of that, if you were to build it yourself, you'd need extremely large and rich data sets. If you were in a translation scenario, you'd actually need lots of different language data sets. And you'd also need the infrastructure to be able to train these. And so when you start breaking it down, you can see actually just being able to call an API very quickly and completely translate some of your documents is incredibly amazing.
This is great. There's so many ways these services help scale when building applications and supporting different business processes. Do you have an example that illustrates some of these ideas in action?
Yeah, so one story that really illustrates some of the points we've just talked about is actually the work done by Vodafone. So, Vodafone is a global telecommunications company, and they're actively expanding their digital strategy. They need flexible, scalable technology solutions to meet these digital ambitions. Vodafone used cognitive services to develop a personal digital assistant, and they named it Toby. Toby's working in their customer service interactions and helping support all those interactions. They built this bot using the Microsoft Bot Framework, the language understanding service, as well as many of the other Azure cognitive services. One of the really nice pieces was how easily they could connect other technologies within their business as well. They had really positive results early on. The assistant was working incredibly well in a customer service interaction. Vodafone wanted to scale this solution much further. And so they first deployed Toby into Italy, but decided they actually wanted language-specific versions in 15 other markets. So in order to adopt a bot in a country's local language, Vodafone adopted the translator, which is a Azure Cognitive Services that allows for real-time AI-based text translation. The company currently makes Toby available in 15 different languages, and they have even more planned. So scaling from 1 to 15 different languages was massively accelerated by the use of these APIs. And I mean, the general scale also speaks for itself. Vodafone reported that in December 2020, Toby now holds 25 to 30 million conversations a month with its customers, and it handles 60% of all customer interactions.
So many conversations with Toby. This is a use case that truly demonstrates the scalability of our AI services. And in this case, it was essential that our AI solutions were easy to use for Vodafone's conversational designers to build modular technologies to support the company's ambitions and make Toby the biggest chatbot in the world. Okay, so now I'm curious. Can you show us the technology that Vodafone used for translation?
Yeah, of course. Let me show you the translator service in action. Most sites, websites, documents, etc. will have to go through a lengthy and expensive translation process anytime any new text or changes are made to the document. With the translation service, you can save your files, be that HTML, PDF, docx, etc., and translate them into multiple different languages, so up to 90 different languages and dialects.
But what if I have a graph in the middle of my document? What language would it show up in?
That's a great question. Check out this complex document that was translated using the Translator API. So in this case, we can see the whole document's been translated, and it kind of looks like that was the original language it was meant to be in. So in the case of adding a graph here, that would also be translated and show up as if it was the language that it had been created in. Something else I wanted to mention that might help with these types of things, these complex documents, is also adding translation systems that are built using the custom translator. The custom translators available through the same cloud APIs that are highly scalable, highly secure, etc. But the custom translator actually provides neural machine translation for these custom models. This results in really great quality translation and also the understanding of your specific business terminology. In order to do this, you can actually provide your own previously translated documents to build up this customized translation system. So it will really add that extra quality if you need it with specific terminology.
It's interesting you give that example, as I know we use our APIs at scale within many of our own products internally as well. For example, Metrics Advisor, another one of Azure's cognitive services, uses AI to perform data monitoring and anomaly detection in time series data.
Absolutely. These APIs, by design, are used for enterprise and production workloads, and that's why they're built into our first-party services for you to use.
Given that most areas of scalability are taken care of for developers when it comes to Azure cognitive services, are there any other considerations they should keep in mind?
There are a couple of design points to consider when it comes to using cognitive services. For example, if you're thinking about using them outside of the cloud. So one of the reasons, there are many, that you might want to call the cognitive services outside the cloud is if you need high throughput and low latency as a requirement. So you need to be able to send many transactions as quickly as possible. In this case, you could deploy the Azure Cognitive Services physically closer to that application logic and your data, and it would therefore sit in a container that you're able to use and still use that amazing API that's available from Azure. Containers don't cap transactions per second and can be made to actually scale up and out, just like we spoke about at the start, as long as you provide the necessary hardware resources for that.
That's great to know. Is there anything else developers should keep in mind when scaling with Azure Cognitive Services?
Yeah, another consideration can be made when scaling cognitive services applications to big data workloads. So Azure Cognitive Services for Big Data lets users channel terabytes of data through our cognitive services using the popular big data framework called Apache Spark. With only a few lines of code, Azure Cognitive Services can be used with the PySpark API in the Microsoft Machine Learning Spark namespace. This also applies to Scala and Java, which are incredibly popular big data languages.
This has been great. Thanks so much for joining us, Amy, and for explaining all things scale when it comes to Azure Cognitive Services.
Of course. Thanks so much for inviting me onto Azure AI Essentials.
We've covered so much great information today. Azure Cognitive Services has truly been built with scalability in mind, and it's easy to see that just by looking at how simple it is to scale cognitive services for large workloads. Whether your customers' usage of cognitive services increases or decreases, and regardless of your innovation pace, Azure AI supports your innovation scalability so you can focus on the rest of development. We're excited to see what you build using Azure AI solutions, knowing that your applications can seamlessly scale. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Azure AI Essentials. Until next time.